We have here today Professor Astell from Department of Theology of Notre Dame University, who has kindly agreed to talk to us about Professor René Girard and her memories of Professor René Girard. And so I would like to begin by asking you, when did you first hear about Professor René Girard? And how did what drew you to him?
Yes. Well, my first encounter with the thought of René Girard was in 1996, and it was through a book by Sandra Goodhart called Sacrificing Commentary. And I had agreed to review the book. We had just hired Professor Goodhart. I was amazed. I'd never encountered the word sacrifice being used the way he used it, and I understood that it was he was developing René Girard's theory, and then as a follow-up gift, Professor Goodhart gave me Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World. So as a Christmas gift, which I understood was a task, but yeah, and so but it was one of those books, and they're rare, where you're reading so intently, and making comments in the margins and reading from cover to cover, which is what I did in reading Things Hidden. Professor Girard came to campus at Purdue, where I was teaching at the time. It was fall of 1998. It was my first face-to-face meeting with him. And then there were much more frequent contacts when I started to get involved with the Colloquium, Violence and Religion. So my first meeting with him in a cover context was in 2001 in Antwerp. The following year, I helped to host with Professor Goodhart the meeting of cover at Purdue. And then after that, it was just every year. And Professor Girard, he came to all of our meetings until I think the last one was at Riverside in California. And after that, his health did not permit him to keep coming on an annual basis.
So can you tell me a little bit about your encounter with him? What kind of an encounter did you have with him? What kind of an impression did he make on you?
Oh, such an impressive man. Yeah, I was really quite in awe of him. His work, he's a true intellectual, right? And so his work kind of crosses boundaries. You have the sense of someone who's really been touched by truth somehow, and because of that contact with truth, has the daring to cross disciplinary boundaries. And so it's a feast for the mind and the soul, to be reading one of his books and be able to, combine anthropology and sociology and philosophy and biblical studies and mysticism. I mean, it was like everything that's important to the human experience could somehow be touched upon by following his central insights and applying them here and there. So when he first came to Purdue, this was my first face-to-face meeting with him. I remember we talked about Joan of Arc, and he encouraged me to kind of continue thinking about Joan of Arc, as a kind of a scapegoated figure. And so I ended up writing a whole book about Joan of Arc and Joan of Arc and sacrificial authorship. And I think that's probably the single work of mine, it's a single monograph where Girard is present everywhere. And most of my other scholarly work engaging his theory has been article length studies, many of them literary, Chaucer, Oscar Wilde, Henry James, the British Romantics, kind of lots of literary figures. And then also on the theology side, Simone Weil. I've done a lot of work with Simone Weil and Girard. and a little bit with Dorothy Day. And I'm a medievalist by training, believe it or not.
Oh,
And so I think that what I find so fascinating is his sort of revival of a fourfold biblical exegesis, and that is very central to my interests. But as a person, so humble, um, so great, and very warm. And he had a way of sort of making it. There would be an atmosphere in a room, and people would be um, uh, sharing an experience, right? In his presence. Um, and when I went to the cover meetings too, I've really never gone to an academic meeting like it, in the sense that it was interdisciplinary, it was family-like. When he was attending, you had the sense, well, this is a student of his, this is a friend of his. We're all kind of welcomed into this larger circle. He was very encouraging of younger people's work. Um, um, yes, magnanimous in that way.
okay. Wonderful. Um, I noticed you had your one of your last books is on mysticism and Girard. Can you tell me a little bit about your discoveries of where and how he was interested in mysticism?
Well, no, actually, I made this kind of an object of systematic study, and I regret very much that I was not able to ask him some things, before he died. But he actually died the semester when I was writing the essay on Girard and violence and mysticism, and I so whatever insights I had at that time, I would like to attribute them to his guiding spirit.
Right.
Um, and but when you kind of look at the people that he was fascinated by, besides Simone Weil, um, many of them could lay a claim to the title mystic. Uh, Pascal, for instance, appears prominently in his last conversation with Benoit Chant. Um, Holderlin, who was actually very important to Girard, he even made a kind of a pilgrimage, to Tübingen, to see where Holderlin had lived for many years, and he's one of those figures that spans the whole trajectory of Girard's thought. He's been an abiding interest for him. So Pascal, Holderlin, Augustine, yeah, and Weil. I think those were the principal ones. But then, of course, there's the biblical mysticism. So there's kind of these hidden meanings, right? That he was always discovering in the scriptures themselves, which I think is probably his greatest claim, to an interest in mysticism. And then, interestingly, when he was elected to the Academy of France, he ended up taking the chair, of, I forget who it was, but a Dominican scholar. And in his acceptance speech, Girard speaks about mysticism and mystical theology, and shows that he actually knew a lot about it. And he wanted to pay a tribute to the last holder of the chair he was to occupy. But it also kind of awakened some interest in his audience about about that occupancy, and what was fitting about it, that Girard would take that chair. So things hidden since the foundation of the world, right? suggest that there's a kind of a mysticism. His personal conversion experience, he talked about it as being quasi-mystical, what he felt at that time. Yeah, so it was, so I kind of followed it through as systematically as I could, and just learned a lot in the process, but he always denied that he was a mystic. and if anyone called him a mystic, he said, "You're my critic," right? You know, the critics are always calling me some kind of Gnostic or mystic. And so he wanted to defend himself against that kind of charge of being an obscurantist, I guess is the noun form for that.
But Anne, why was he so much against being called a mystic? René Girard was a man of light. He really knew the truth, and he had a lot of love.
People experienced him, as you yourself are bearing witness now. You know, he also called himself an ordinary Christian, but I don't think that's, you can really, who would say he's an ordinary Christian? No, he's an extraordinary Christian. And, you know, on the occasion of his death, right? I mean, Bishop Robert Barron, you know, was calling him a doctor of the church, you know, someone who really is so important, you know, to the life of the church. Lived Christianity, lived religiosity, I think. But it was, I think, he liked to call himself a scientist. But yet, in his particular approach to science, he always kind of gave the mystics a place at the table, right? You know, so he didn't exclude them, you know, the way many people do.
So, how many years were you the president of COV&R? We were talking about that. You said 5 years.
I think that the presidency is two-year terms. So I had 2 of those. But before that, I was executive secretary. So I think it was about 10 years, you know, in a leadership position for COV&R.
In all these years that you were the president and you were meeting with Girard and everything, do you have a particular good memory of him that you can share with us?
Oh, yes, you asked me to think about that. And there's 2 memories that. One of them, he didn't say anything. I used to look at the look in his face. but when he came to Germany, to Koblenz, Schoenstatt, for the meeting, right after he had just received his induction, right, into the Academy of France, and I was organizing the meeting, so I thought we have to do something wonderful for René. And I thought I wanted to give him a crown, but I couldn't give him a crown. And you know, you always give people some kind of a gift that will help them to remember a time and a place, right? So I thought I'd like to give him something that he will never forget, that will be sort of German, right? And so I got the idea of giving him a Bavarian hunter's hat, you know, with a little feather.
Right.
And so I went with a friend to downtown Koblenz, and we used like a 10-gallon hat because he had a kind of a big head. and I think he was shocked, right, to receive such a present.
Was he shocked?
Yeah, shocked, you know, and I don't know if he ever wore it, but he did put it on. So on the day that he received that gift from me, and I thought, well, you know, this. I mean, how many people could you give a hat to? It kind of bears witness to kind of his, you know, his family feeling, right? And the other memory is from a meeting in Stanford. This really impressed me. Imitatio had just been founded, and some of us were invited for some kind of consultation meeting. René was present, and the Theo Foundation, of course, was very generous, you know, in establishing Imitatio. And so they had brought in someone who is an expert in outcomes assessment. And this person at the meeting asked the General Assembly, by what measure can you determine if the mimetic theory has been successful?
That's a good question. That's a very good question. That's a very good question.
Well, we were dumbfounded. Uh, it sounded so much like, the outcomes analysis lingo, right? That
Right.
we get at the universities. Um, so there was just this big silence in the room.
Right.
And then René broke the silence. I think he may even have stood up, but he said, the success of the mimetic theory is not the discovery that we have been victimized, scapegoated. It's easy to know that. We all feel and experience at some time that we are victims. The success of the mimetic theory is the discovery that I myself have victimized another. I have joined the crowd. The success of the theory is the same as the recognition of St. Peter, who wept bitterly after denying Christ out of fear of the crowd.
Fantastic.
Yeah, it really left us, again silent, all right, but not because of the awkwardness of a question, but because of the
Found.
brilliance and acuteness, of the response, and coming from René himself. Wow. Yeah.
Could I ask you what's your favorite book of his?
I guess I would say Things Hidden Since the Foundation of the World, because it's one of those you go back to again and again, and of course it was the first book I read, and so it has that specialness. I always recommend I See Satan Fall to people who want some kind of introduction to Girard, and I do like Battling to the End.
Oh,
I
you
know it's one
do?
of his more controversial books, but I like it a lot. I like it because in it, partly at the prompting of Benoit, right, he completes his theory, right. I had always been troubled by the lack of a technical term in Girard's theory for that special imitatio Christi, right? Because it's not an internal mediation. It is not an external mediation. It's in a class of its own, right? And there was no name for it. And I look back on one of the interviews with James Williams, and where Williams was René. I mean, there seems to be something missing here, but he didn't seem to want to fill that gap. But finally, in Battling to the End, he does, and where he speaks of the inmost or innermost mediation. And I think it was very important that he did that, because otherwise there's always going to be confusion about his theory. Even among Girardians, I find it, I guess I'll just say what I have to say. But sometimes the mimetic theory is taken to mean that there's no authentic love, right? That you can never love another person because you love another person, right? That it's always because somebody else, and
Sure.
that's not true. If you read Girard closely, he talks about kind of giving away what is a foundational freedom, right? And there he sounds pretty Kierkegaardian, um, but he and when you think about his relationship with Martha Girard, what a beautiful, steadfast marriage, over so long and loving, and so the possibility of genuine human relationships that are personal, and the idea of an inmost mediation, it allows for all of those genuine human relationships, because they're grounded in the mediation of Christ. So for me, it was very important also, from an anthropological point of view, that he completed his theory in Battling to the End.
Right. But what do you make of does it give any hope? Because the book, in the beginning of the book, he wrote, "This is my most apocalyptic book."
Yes.
And it's pretty apocalyptic, but does it give any hope? Does it give any solution to this apocalypse? What are your thoughts on that?
I think it's in Battle into the End where he says that actually um, Christian hope has always been apocalyptic, right? You know, so that when you think about the early Christians, you know, they were waiting for Christ to come back soon, right? And they were all expecting to be martyrs, right?
Right.
So persecution, natural catastrophes, you know, you know, that didn't surprise them, you know, but their hope, you know, was grounded, you know, in their own experience of charity in this life, right? And in the fullness of that charity in the life to come. And so no one can take our lives from us. We, you know, there's always the possibility of giving, right? And so when he talks about refusing violence, right, it sounds a lot like Origen, actually, the early father of the church, who was a confessor, and preached nonviolence. You know, so yeah, it's, you know, it says that do we have to conquer the violence inside of ourselves so that we can be nonviolent, you know, toward our enemies. And so in a way, I think the hopefulness about the catastrophes is that it puts us in a position where we can exercise that radical hope, um, and yeah. So this it he will come again.
Oh, wonderful. Okay. Well, thank you very much, Professor Astell, for taking time for this interview and making this interview with us. Really greatly appreciated. So I thank you very much, and your comments and observations were wonderful and really contributed a lot to this project that we're putting together to a tribute film to Professor Girard. So
Yeah,
thank you very much.
and I thank you for doing that.